but if I'm imagining correctly, I think he's talking about on the original contract. And in on the original contract, Hume kind of makes this argument, which is, you know, here Hume again, he's talking to a bunch of Lockeans, really. He's talking to a Whig party that is very strongly Lockean. And the Lockeans in his country basically believe that they established a moment of true Lockean consent during the Glorious Revolution when parliamentary supremacy was established. Okay, Hume goes, all right. And you have these views, Hume talking to the Lockeans, he says, you have these views that say that consent is the basis of governmental legitimacy. That consent is what makes a government legitimate. It's what you need to make a government legitimate. Then Hume goes, let's look at all of history. Throughout most of history, most governments are not founded in moments of consent. They are founded in moments of usurpation and conquest. Some other king, somebody within the country who doesn't have a right to kingship becomes king, or a king from another country conquers your country. That's how most governments throughout history have been formed, Hume says. And then Hume goes, we kind of have, remember, Hume's an empiricist. Hume really loves the empirical facts of things. And he goes, well, empirically, then we have an issue. Because most people in most governments throughout most of human history have acted as though their governments are legitimate. They worship, they praise the king. They worship the gods that the king tells them to worship. They act as though, and it's more than just, it's not all just fear of the axe. You actually can't run a country, even a small country, even a small kingdom, by just threatening to kill every single individual person in that kingdom. You need people to kind of buy in. You need people to hand over their grain when the tax man shows up, right? And you don't just do that by shoving a gun in their face. Most societies, most people have seen their governments as legitimate, even though the governments didn't come around by any consensual process. So Hume kind of turns to the contractarians and goes, who are you to say that all those people throughout history were wrong? Who are you to say that there have basically only been one legitimate government that was founded in England in the 1600s? Your theory is, and echoes of Burke here, there's a reason we have you read these two together. Your theory is ahistorical. Your theory is too based on one culture and the standards and beliefs of one culture. What about all these other ways of living? Hume says consent can be a way of legitimating government, but it's definitely not the only way. It's not even close to the most common way that government is legitimated. Hume kind of does a logical attack on the contractarians where he goes, okay, why would I have consented? Hume goes, why should I listen to the government I didn't consent? And the contractarians, all of them, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, go, well, you would have consented, so we can treat you as having consented, right? We talked about this last week. And then Hume goes, okay, let's take the argument a step further. I'm going to ask the contractarians, why would I have consented? And Hume notices every time you do this, the contractarians start telling you how useful the government is. Hobbes tells you you would have consented because the government protects your life. Locke tells you you would have consented because the government protects your rights. Rousseau tells you you would have consented because the government allows you to maintain freedom through autonomy as a law given unto yourself. And so Hume goes, hold on. You were telling me consent is what did it, is what made government legitimate. But then when I push you, you start talking about how useful the government is. This must mean that usefulness is what makes government legitimate, not consent. So if these people who live under these governments that were founded by usurpation or conquest nonetheless find that it's better to live in a government than not, nonetheless find that they have more rights or more ability to keep things they want under the king than they did when they were living under the previous king, or living in the state of nature, living in a, not in a, again, Hume doesn't think there's a state of nature, but maybe then living in the wilderness, right? If they just see the government as being more good than bad, that's all it takes for people to actually find a government legitimate. So that's tied into that argument. And that's where Hume says, and again, it's unclear whether he's describing this or whether he's aligning himself with this viewpoint. But the only argument he gives as a grounds of government legitimacy is usefulness. And he points out that's kind of all the contractarians are giving you too. This whole language game about consent, this whole unnecessary thing, it's just this structure that we can get rid of. We don't actually need it because even they appeal to consent at the end of the day. Or excuse me, even they appeal to usefulness at the end of the day. So usefulness must be the true grounds of legitimacy, not consent.